Hey, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Indie Game Movement, the podcast that talks about the marketing and business of indie games. I'm Andrew Pappas, and I'm going to be your host today, and we're going to be talking about rethinking how indie games get funded. Building an indie game takes more than just funding alone. It also takes support, resources, and a path to market. But too often, those pieces get tied to a single assumption: finding a publisher. So, in this episode, we unpack that mindset and explore how developers can think more strategically about funding, partnerships, and building a more sustainable path forward that's grounded in action and not assumption. So, that's what we're going to be talking about right here today on Indie Game Movement. Hey everyone, and we're back. And today I have Julien Ramette. Julien, how's it going? And thank you so much for being here today. It's really awesome to have you.
Thank you for the invite.
Of course. Well, folks, like I said, I have Julien here. But for those of you who don't know, he is the co-founder and CEO of Not a Shark Company. And I know you've worked previously at Focus Entertainment. You were the chief of business development there, and Ubisoft as well, business development director. But please, tell us a little bit about Not a Shark Company, and maybe a little bit about some of your past experiences too.
Oh, that's a long story. I will try to make it short. But yeah, before Ubisoft, I was at Wargaming. Before that, I was at Bandai, and before that, I was at Atari Infogram. So I started 20 years ago. And across all these years, I've been very frustrated of the publishing relations between publishers and developers. I was myself business development, so I was in charge of acquisition of content from a publishing perspective. And I saw more and more studio who was frustrated with the lack of service, the lack of marketing support, the lack of visibility, deal terms as well, but that's another problem. And so we've seen that there was a need to help and support studios to self-publish with a different model. So what we did is we simply applied the codev or work for hire model to publishing, meaning that we are doing a service which is a la carte, paid per hour or per month per people, so that we can build custom teams for studios to self-publish. But it's also addressing to some publishers who might want to increase their resources from time to time, instead of hiring and firing 6 months later. So yeah, we are here basically to help with more flexibility and help with additional workload and specific crunch period.
Awesome. And I love kind of like the story behind that journey too, because you worked at all these places and stuff, but you started to like pick up and see some of these frustrations and stuff that was happening, and it's not just from your own experiences. I mean, this is kind of a systemic thing, across the industry. So building Not a Shark out of this like need, right? Frustration is I always love, those are like some of my favorite stories to hear, is like how people like see these problems and finding a different way to approach them for people who really need that type of support.
Yeah, indeed. But the story goes 7 years ago, I started to see a couple of studios I really wanted to work with. And they were already building their own publishing department. So studios like Dontnod, Starbreeze, People Can Fly, this type of big studios. But when you know publishing, you understand that the publishing team can manage easily 10 titles per year. So I was seeing studios who were doing it for one title. So the question was why? I went to speak with them, and the answer was like, yeah, but we don't want those deal terms. We want more flexibility. We want to be in control. So that's how I had this idea of publishing as a service.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's like, again, it's these things that can really drive change and everything else in the industry, which is always why I'm excited to hear. Now, Julien, I know you're dealing a lot with Not a Shark and stuff, but when you do have some downtime, what are some things you do to unplug or relax or just have fun?
Games, I think I'm a game addict. I'm playing a bit of everything. Recently, I just finished, it was time, Hades 2. I went back to roguelikes. It started with Absolom. I don't know if you did this one, but a brilliant roguelike from Dotemu. And so after which I went on Hades 2, and now I went back on Binding of Isaac to tell you a bit how hard I am on it. But playing as well Drop Duchy at the moment. I just finished Blueprints a couple of weeks ago. So yeah, and Resident Evil Requiem, but only during the day because it scares me.
That's my problem with those games too. I have to play them in the day, I think, or yeah. That's funny.
No, and outside of gaming, it's basically going outside, hiking, skateboarding, this type of nature.
Nice. Skateboarding. I love that. I don't hear that too often, but sweet.
Yeah, I'm a bit too old now, so I would say I
don't ever say that. Because I kept thinking that about, I used to play hockey like most of my childhood and young adult life. I played hockey, and then recently I as a means to like, hey, winter activity to stick around and stuff, I was like, you know what, why can't I get back into hockey? So I made the commitment, bought all the equipment, haven't really had a organized joined a league or anything like that, but I'm just saying it's never too old. That's all I'm saying.
Well, I wish it was true.
All right, fair enough. All right, well, hey, thank you for sharing those details. Now, we do want to get to know you a little bit more, and how we do that, folks, is through the Q box round. And of course, I have a couple of quick random questions prepared here for Julien today. So, Julien, are you ready for the Q box round?
Yes, please.
All right. Well, the first one is, what's the most common mistake you see companies make in the industry with their businesses?
So definitely I would say the lack of preparation. I've been quite astonished to see developers and publishers alike starting a project without getting the basics, without conducting a proper market study, a proper due diligence of the project, thinking really through all the aspects of their project. It's a bit like everyone has a time pressure. Everyone wants to go fast, and I think it's a mistake in terms of creativity. You need to iterate. You need to find the right recipe. You need to think through every aspect so that, from a game perspective, so that your gameplay is in synergy with the lore, with level design, with everything. And some start with just one element and discover too late that they wasted a lot of time on this. Me, for example, if I took not a shark company, it's been 8-10 years that I was thinking about creating that company, but it took me 7 years to actually have the proper idea and see the star aligning. And so that's globally what I would say to everyone is always start with a market study, always start with a proper on paper game design, or at least a game design document. I see so many studios who don't have that document. And even if it's boring to create, which I totally agree, it forces oneself to lay down the frame of the project and to ask oneself the right questions. So preparation, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And you've heard it here a lot of times on the show, folks, are like, know your audience. That statement really encompasses a lot of what Julien just said. And also, focus, setting those constraints. It might feel like you're not doing any work because you're not doing dev stuff, but as Julien said, that is absolutely essential. All right, next here is, what's the most helpful or impactful advice you ever received?
So it will be a bit contrary to what I just said, but I will. The best advice I had was to listen to my gut feelings. I think I've spent too many years rationalizing things, trying to find logic and so on, which down the line did not really bring me success. So I'm not saying that you should do whatever you feel. It's more about generally your gut feeling is right. Use your brain just to compute probabilities of success. So that's how I'm working now. Basically, my gut is taking the decision based on statistics that my brain is computing. But yeah, and this is something I apply when selecting people, when selecting projects, and it's frightening to see that open the doubt I had were right down the line. So I always try to give people chances and project chances and rationalize around it to see pro, cons, etc. But 99% of the time, my first impression is right. So I'm starting to listen more to my gut feelings.
Yeah, and those can help out in so many different ways. And I think sometimes like what I see personally sometimes with my gut feelings is this a clear yes or a clear no? Like using that same kind of intuition, because that in itself can save, as you have probably identified in your own experience, lots of frustration, time, whatever it may be. It can help out tremendously, or identify lots of really good opportunities that are worth pursuing.
The problem of this industry is there is a lot of clever people, but clever people who tends to overthink things, and the more question you have, the more blurry is the answer. So sometimes people tends to get lost in the quantity and complexity of the questions. So yeah, it helps to listen to answer.
Definitely. That actually does conclude our Q box round. Only reason because Julien really totally just shared everything he in terms of the games that he was playing, because that's usually folks. I hope you're not missing out, because and you identified that like what games he was playing now is what he called out to, Resident Evil Requiem, specifically playing it during the day. And again, I'm with you on that, and a bunch of the others, Hades 2 and stuff. So thank you for sharing all that information about yourself, so we could get to know you a little bit more. And now, Julien, let's get into the heart of this conversation, which I let in, folks, with the intro saying that we're talking about rethinking how we, indie games specifically, get funded. And I want to kick things off, Julien, with asking you this. Why do you think so many indie developers, still build their plans around finding a publisher, even when publishing funding has been far less accessible lately?
Yes, but it has always been the case. Historically, the period of growth we had post-COVID was exceptional, but we went back today in the good old days where funding was a problem. I would say the crisis we see today is not really an industry crisis, in the sense that the industry is still growing. It's not shrinking, right? It's rather a problem of funding, actually. The fact that investors are scared after the hunger of COVID. It's also the issue of the liberalization of the freedom of the market. We all fought recent years to open the market, having tools accessible for free to develop games, platforms. So speaking about Unreal and Unity, a platform to distribute direct to consumer without the need to have even a company behind it, because any individual can submit a game on Steam, and so on, have created a flood of developers and projects. So creatively, it has been a great time, but at the same time, we are creating a massive amount of competition, which reduce as well the chance of finding fundings. There is a limited amount of solutions and publishers who can fund. So obviously there is more competition to find those. And also, I think it's a problem of the lack of support the industry is getting. I'm surprised to see that there is so few countries that is actually providing financial support, tax credit, even though it has been proven that this has a direct positive impact on the industry of that country. Namely, if you look at what Canada has been doing, they've been extremely prolific in terms of creativity. Germany, it's the same. They have a very great program. France as well. I mean, France is a very small country worldwide when we look at the amount of population, and still from development of video game, it's quite big in terms of amount of production. And this is notably thanks to those tax credits. But outside of those countries, you don't have much things. So that's the first issue, where government still sees the video game as not as a noble art. So it also we need to fight for this. I think we still don't have the same status than literature or movies can have. So that's
Yes.
the first. The second topic is regarding the different options of funding. So today you don't have hundreds of choices. Either you have what we call love money and rich people around you happy to give you what you need, or you need to go through a publisher or investors. But today, after the crisis, most investors have fled toward AI platforms and they don't really fund projects or don't really fund studios. And last thing is Kickstarter. But Kickstarter has been in big trouble because of the lack of trust on the platform and there's so many projects that have not delivered. I think as an industry, we need to find new ways of funding. I salute here one initiative we are partnered with called GameVestor. It's a new kind of Kickstarter crowdfunding, but where people who fund actually get a percentage of the sales. So on top of getting rewards, they can get actually revenue out of it. And there is a selection on projects which are close to be released. So it's much more likely those projects will deliver. But you see, it's the only one I found recently when we could suppose more initiatives like this should be done. So yeah, that's unfortunate. I think it's a mix of, on one side, too many projects, too many studios, and a market that is probably too open. On another side, the lack of initiatives, the lack of options.
Yeah. So lots of things going on here and everything else as you outlined. Just to talk a little bit more on kind of the publisher side of things. I'm curious when, especially as it relates to funding. So let's say when a studio does get publisher funding, what are they really gaining beyond the money itself? Because I think it's an important thing to consider because a lot of times, focus is money, then it might be marketing, then whatever else.
So the first thing to say is, in the majority of cases, having a publisher does not make you rich, for the reason that deal terms, when you have first recoupment and the standard rev share we've seen in the industry, you need to be extremely successful, to be able to fund another project. So we've seen for years studios were always running after the money. Because they get the funding for the projects they're currently working on. The time recoupment happens, they still need to pay the salaries and their team and so on. So even 6 months before releasing a new game, they have to pitch a new one, get the funding. So it's extremely tense for that. So yeah, it pays for the resources and for the project. It rarely pays above significantly. No, the real value of a publisher is, in my opinion, especially for young studios, is to be able to grow your studio. So to grow a team and to build internal processes and tool sets and methodologies and know-how. So I think publishers are really good in that sense, that they can accompany the growth of studios for it to build its reputation. So that's, in my opinion, the main value. And then, yes, there is a value in publishing itself. So marketing, distribution, first-party relations, QA, playtest, and so on. The truth is, it really depends on which publisher. And some publishers will put a lot of resources to support the project, and they can even commit contractually to do so, and that will be my first advice here is to make sure there is an actual commitment in terms of marketing spendings or in terms of QA, localization spending, and so on, because this is what matters. But some other publishers just put 2-3 people behind the project and that's it, and they try to do things organically. So you see what I'm trying to say is sometimes, because down the line a lot of studios are likely not to be rich with their project. Sometimes it's preferable to sacrifice potential revenues to get real expertise, to get real commitment, to get a real partner who is going to help you building your processes and your studio.
Yeah, really good point there too, because I mean, I think that's very clear and helpful on what you said, helping you build your studio. And when you outlined, those internal processes and everything, those are a lot of things that moves things, that moves the needle, that gets things done. Those processes, it improves the skill sets, it improves your scalability with the type of project you're able to do. Though, and I think it's great that you call that out, because those are identifying like key things that are really going to help a studio work towards sustainability and all those other factors. Where you did mention too before about chasing the money, right? And I think this is another interesting thing, a negative thing that can happen people don't realize. And you see a lot of times, I feel like GDC is like a place where people are like, hey, we're getting more funding, we're looking for more investment funds, we already received this fund and this fund, and let's say it's across two different investors. Now, but the problem, a lot of people don't think, it's like, wow, they keep getting money and everything. But the reality of it is, by having multiple investors, they want their investment back. And now you're diluting basically that. It becomes a little bit less valuable. Questions are going to come arise like, well, what's really going on with the project? How is it? Well, is it managed well? And then a lot of times too, and I'm sure you've seen this, like you have people who go through all these rounds and the next thing you know, they're not doing anything now because they keep eating it up. And what they were focusing on was the money rather than, let's say, those internal processes you just called out to.
Yeah. But generally, you always have to sacrifice something.
Yeah.
So let's say if you go with a publisher, you will sacrifice future revenue. You may sacrifice, in some cases, your IP or part of it. Most likely, they are not going to touch to your equity, even though it could. But yeah, so the real objective of going with a publisher is to grow your studio, to build those processes, to build some technology and know-how and stuff like this, so that after you can potentially be independent. However, if you look directly at VCs, the problem is you will lose control. Naturally, especially if you are a young valuation of a young studio with unproven track record, or at least as a team, as a formed team, makes it that any project, generally, investors will take a majority, or it will be very hard to stick below that. So you will lose your control. You will have investors constantly asking you for reports and for information and auditing basically your company, so you won't spend time working actually.
Yeah.
And also they will pressure. In a lot of cases, we've seen investors pressuring studios to do bad things, bad decisions. The typical example is our investors want absolutely to prove our KPI, so we are going to announce now. So they announce in advance just because time pressure, because they want result, without taking into account that, I don't know, mid-December is probably not the right timing to announce a game. And we've seen that so many times. Or clearly games that should have a precise business model, like free-to-play. And investors coming saying, oh, no, we are not at ease with free-to-play, so let's make it premium. But yeah, but it's a multiplayer game. There is a high probability you're not going to succeed. So you see, we've seen so many bad decisions that has been pushed by investors who wanted control because they not necessarily know the industry. And yeah, when they are in majority, they want to make sure their money is safe.
Yeah.
So they start interfering.
Exactly. And it's funny too, because in those cases, they look at it as the project in itself as an asset. And
yeah.
I know sometimes I call games here products. They are assets, and that's a good way to look at them. But the reality is we're passionate. This is like a form of art we're creating and everything else. And sometimes that's hard to hear. And what you just called out too is no different than what sometimes happens in the film industry too, when they have things called completion bonds. And it's really similar behavior. And what those are is a completion bond guarantees that a project will get finished by any mean possible. So they could get Jim off the street with a camera to finish that movie, and they don't care because it's just going to get done. So no art or direction vision or anything is applied to wherever that completion bond was executed. And what you just said, it's no different than like an investor or someone else breathing down your throat. And And when you're talking about taking time to build internal processes, yeah, it might not be fun, but man, at least it's building up your company. Whereas someone else is always asking for a report, checking in. Hey, when is this going to happen? Type stuff. It's scary.
Especially because the expectations from investors are totally not in line with the reality of business.
Right.
The amount of time we've seen investors telling us that they were looking for times 10 their investment in 5 years, but in which world do they live? It's not what the video game is is doing, right? If you look especially at how studios are growing, look at From Software. Before being Elden Ring success with over 20 million copies sold, before that, it's coming from a game called Kingsfield in '87, a game which had like a 50% Metacritic user score back in the days. And they did Kingsfield 1, Kingsfield 2. It didn't work at all. And then after, with the change of generation and new console, they went to design Demon's Souls, who was the beginning of the success, but it was still very timid. And then Dark Souls 1, Dark Souls 2, Dark Souls 3. Here you start entering the AAA space to finally reach Elden Ring. It's a journey that took them 25 years. So yeah, and you can look at any major studio. All of them have a similar story of growing their studio from one title to another with a clear vision. Look, for example, at Digital Extremes. Digital Extreme, a lot of people forget that they were doing Unreal Tournament back in the days. So yep, there is investors should understand that it's an investment that will take at least 10, 15 years to be profitable to the extent they are looking for.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important distinction and call out there too, because with these things, it's not a project per project basis. It's really investing in the company, the people behind it, which is why it's so important that when you are doing pitches and all that stuff, that's why they look at that information about the company. What can you actually deliver? What are you building towards and everything else? And it really is a long-term thing, which is why sustainability is so important.
Yeah, but you're totally right. I always say it's not a production line, it's not a factory, it's closer to a mission to Mars. It's basically, you're putting people in a capsule, you have 3 years to achieve your objective, and any issue during the journey is mean you're dead, basically. So yeah, that's why consistency, team spirit, people who know each other and trust each other is fundamental in the success of a project.
Absolutely. I want to kind of shift things a little bit too in terms of like weighing in the idea of, support paths more strategically. And the reason I'm calling out to this too, and for those of you who are thinking, oh, this doesn't necessarily align with funding. Well, it really does. It's like not necessarily diversifying. It's more about like allocating certain time, effort, and stuff into receiving support, and how people provide that support is a means. It is when I look at money, I don't necessarily look at it money. I look at it from an angle of resources and money being part of that resource. But ultimately, you need the resources to deliver the game, to work towards everything we just talked about. So I know traditionally, like publishing is in a mass level is kind of one way to secure that type of support of resources, right? But what would you say are other paths you think that are more indie teams should seriously consider?
So because of the issue of funding we've seen recently, it's funny to see that we see more and more co-production and co-development opportunities, meaning that we start to see studios who were traditionally doing co-development work for hire, paid, that have enough cash and bandwidth to sustain a project by allocating resource to it, so that the studio, instead of raising a couple of millions, but don't necessarily need that. They can already work with an established team, so they gain time, efficiencies. They don't need, yes, it will be an exchange of a rev share, but generally it's a fairer way of looking at it because it's basically splitting the cost and the revenues proportionally. I think that's something that it's a trend starting. I saw a handful of studios doing that at the moment and looking at that. Definitely something I recommend to explore.
Yeah, definitely. Because it's like, again, there's so, like, it's funny earlier. Guests that I spoke with, we were talking about that too in terms of what it equates to time and stuff. And sometimes we have this mentality of, like, oh, it's my time, and there's a cost to this, and so, but I could do it for free. But the reality is you're not working on your project either, and you're probably doing something that you're nowhere near as good as the other person who specializes or focuses on that thing.
Yeah, that's a big issue. The do-it-yourself in this industry is very strong. Everyone wants to learn everything and do. We have a lot of one-man armies, right?
Yeah.
But I would say it's the same as building a house. I'm sure that technically I can learn to build a house by myself. I'm pretty sure I'm going to make a lot of mistakes, and I'm pretty sure it's going to take me 5 or 10 years to make it. So that's basically it. So
Yeah.
yeah,
And what does that
people,
cost?
yeah, that's the thing. The cost of mistakes sometimes is huge. So and if it's not mistakes, it's going to cost you time because you will need 10 times more than someone who is specialized doing so. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm curious too though, because like sometimes we might get in this mindset, whether it be limited or just not open enough. How would you say developers can start thinking about these different forms of support that they can receive? Whether that's obviously funding, we already addressed some of those points earlier. But let's say external services or even strategic partners, or people can even help with like go to market type
Yeah.
activities. Like what are like all these different things, and or why don't we do this, because I'm sure we could list off tons. Right?
Yeah.
What would you
Yeah.
say are going to be the most impactful?
Ha. The most impactful. That is a wide question.
That it's still wide.
But I would say today the biggest issue of games are discoverability. Okay. So the fundamental here is to get support to get that visibility. And there is 2, 3 main ways of doing it. One is having enough money to do advertising. And a lot of studios are not spending enough money in advertising because either they don't believe or they don't like or whatever. But I think there is a real problem in terms of a percentage of investment we are putting behind marketing in this industry. You look at cinema, they spent 50 cents to $1 for every dollar spent in production. In the video game industry, it's probably 10 cents out of every dollar in production. So we are far below what it should be. But if you don't have this kind of money, the efforts needed to be done could be on community management. This is the starting point of everything. And I always say either you have time or you have money. A lot of studios have proven that even without investing tons in marketing, by providing a regular, transparent, sustainable community management over a couple of years can lead to excellent results. And here you can look at Peak recently, Among Us, this type of titles, Manor Lord in a different category. These are titles who did 5 years of community management and created this without spending a lot in marketing or in advertising, let's say. Together with that, but obviously, influencer. They are probably the 3 main factors of discoverability. But this is only one side of the equation, because then after, QA and localization are often leftovers. A lot of people are not taking that seriously, especially for games who are complex, who have physics, or games which are multiplayer online. This really needs to have serious QA support. Here, for all these solutions, I'm doing a small bracket here, but for all these, publishers are supposed to provide that service, but you also have providers who can do it at cost or as a rev share. Today, you can find all these different partners who can manage it for you.
And
localization, it's also a big, big topic, especially on how the Steam algorithm is working. Today, if you don't localize your game in certain language, your game will simply not appear in the store, especially because a lot of users have their Steam set on their own language. So basically on the language of your computer. So it starts in French, for example. It will display, the algorithm is going to display me only the games that are localized in French. So why would you spend money in marketing if your game is available on only a small part of the world. Localization is definitely something to do so. Localization, well, you can have the support from your community. A lot of people did that. You have plenty of vendors able to do this. I would just say now you have AI, and I would say be careful with that, especially because AI is going to translate, but it's not going to localize.
Yeah.
And there is a big difference. And especially for certain languages, and I'm thinking about Asian languages like Japanese, Korean, Chinese, and so on, AI does a terrible job. And you see a lot of titles that are review bombed by Chinese community, and it has a huge impact on their user score and on their sales down the line.
Absolutely.
So these areas are really, in my opinion, the key focus. So marketing globally, QA, localization, it starts with those three to ensure you have the best possible quality, that it's available to the larger number, and which is it has a discoverability, and it reach out to that audience. But then after, it's a case by case problems. For example, if you have a highly competitive shooter, multiplayer, here it's more than QA you need to do. It's proper playtesting, and you need to have support and budget for that. It's not having your friends playing the game that is going to make a difference. It's a proper iteration process with regular testing and regular feedback on this. This is the only way to do it properly. So if you plan to release on console, I would advise to look at release management and to get a proper release manager or someone who knows all the submission processes from this platform. I've seen so many games that have failed their submission because they didn't follow the guidelines, because they tried to do it themselves. Sony and Microsoft are very nice. So they have a good account manager who are arranging things. But still, if you fail your release date because you didn't declare properly things, you have to go back to QA. It's an additional cost that you're going to miss. So really, these are the fundamentals.
Absolutely love it. And one thing I'm going to call out to real quick too, what you said earlier is when working with some of these partners too, a lot of times you can get them at cost or using rev share. And I think this is something people forget about a lot too, because publishers in a lot of cases are working with third parties. They are working with other people, and they're plugging that factor into what they are getting in that deal to,
Totally. Today, it's obvious, and that's why we did that business. But for an average indie game, the cost of publishing, if you put all the resources, marketing investment, QA, localization, and everything, starting at $100,000, you can do a job. It's not the best one, but it's an accessible ticket. What I mean is the cost is not so huge. So we are speaking about budgets that are a couple hundreds. So that's the issue a lot of studios have, especially small studios with really low production cost. A game that is sold between 10 and $20. The problem is the project is so small that publishers are not going to put resources behind it. They're probably going to put 1 or 2 people. But to justify investing $50K, $100K in marketing, QA, localization for a title this small, it's basically you need to match the production cost with publishing budget. So it's frightening to see that the smaller the studios are and the project are, the smaller the support they receive proportionally.
Yeah.
You see what I mean? When we spend 20 million or 30 million in the production of a game, I guarantee we will get 5-10 million of publishing cost for all marketing and so on, and no one would bat an eye. Everyone will be fine with that because it's so big, you need that effort. But proportionally, for a small game, no. Very rare are the publishers who are going to commit to put some marketing dollar auditable.
Yeah. But it's quite an interesting dynamic and contrast too when you think about it, because it's like the smaller teams, it's like in terms of what it costs to manage and everything else from a larger team and stuff it's crazy. But there's I don't know if it's just a habit, how things are done where that's looked at, whereas there's I'm sure from a business perspective, there's ways to view it in a way where it's like there potentially is less risk depending on how things are structured and stuff. But I don't know. We're getting into like much deeper stuff there, but it's a really interesting observation.
That's quite crazy, because if you look just at the production cost, let's say we are looking at horror game. I'm taking horror because it's a niche that is generally working well, right? And you see projects at the moment that are very cheap, because you can do a single player, straight line, corridor, horror, with jump scare. So it's easy to develop, right, with Unreal Engine. So we see horror games that are developed with less than $500,000, and they are quite good and quite correct. But if you don't put at least 100 or 200K behind it, it's going to be very complicated to see it. So you're going just to address to the niche and to. So if I make a P&L, and I will say, yeah, what I mean is, like, a lot of people forget about publishing cost. And yeah, having a game at $500,000 is probably a very good opportunity from a publishing standpoint, because it doesn't cost much, because you have a high potential niche, and because you're going to sell. But you totally forget you need to invest more in marketing, in QA, in localization. So basically what I mean is a lot of publishers are sacrificing the fuel to make the race for pure P&L perspective.
Yeah.
Because if you have to put this in a P&L, it's going to double your risk. And so people are like, oh no, it's too risky. But is it too risky to put 1 million on a project with a proper support, or $500,000 on a project with zero support? It's a wide question, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Because, the bottom line, those numbers, they're all so important.
What I mean is, I think it's we need to get this habit of inflating cost when we build P&L. Every time I have this conversation, people are like, oh, why are you... Because when you build a profit and losses, or a forecast of how much you're going to gain on the different scenarios of sales you're going to make, there is a lot of assumptions. The first one is the price point. The studio is telling you, oh, I'm going to sell the game at 29. Who knows? Is it 29? If the game is not good, I'm not going to sell it at 29. I'm going to sell it at 19. So already, so your P&L, discount rate.
Yeah. Lots of losses immediately. No margin.
Discount rate. If your game doesn't sell, you have to do heavy discounts. And people, the amount of people in this industry that don't take into account discounts in their P&L. And they will tell you, oh, we are going to sell 100,000 units at this price. So yeah, but you're going to make discounts and promotion. Steam is working almost exclusively on promotion. So you have to take that into account. And what about production cost? We've studied, that's a study we did back in the days at Focus Entertainment. We studied that in average, games were over budget by 30%. And that's an average. Some of them are exploding the average.
Yeah. Jeez, they go 30%. And let's say you're only launching on Steam. There's 30%.
Yeah.
that adds up quick.
So that's why, basically what I mean is people should be more careful when they build their financial projections, to include more aggressive price point and discounts, to include the fact that the project is going to over budget by 20-30%, by include the fact that they need to invest in publishing, and if they don't put at least 100K, it's not publishing, it's just organic push. So and they should make the evaluation based on all this cost on the worst case scenario. Yep. If you build your financial projection only on the best if, you're always going to find because the idea is not to know how much you're going to gain. The idea is to know how much you risk to lose.
Yeah.
That's a big difference.
It puts it all into perspective. Well, Julien, I can't thank you enough for being here today. But before we close, first, I mean, we talked a lot about different things. What are some key takeaways for listeners to walk away with?
But the first one is take your time. I used to say it's not because there is 2 doctors then you're going to give birth in less than 9 months. So it's a bit the same. Prepare research, do market research before starting a P&L, prepare your game design document before even coding or anything. A good game design should work on paper. And take your time. Creativity needs time and needs iteration. So that's the first advice. The second are for teams. is don't scale too fast. I think the recent layoff crisis we've seen is proving that is too many studios are trying to grow. But I think we are in an industry that needs flexibility. You generally don't master your release date. You're often late in deliveries. You need more time to iterate. Activity is seasonal. So what I mean is the industry should adapt and be more flexible with smaller core team and externalizing more what they need on the spot. And that goes for studios as well. Above 10 people, it starts to be complicated. Above 20%, you don't even know the name of everyone. And above 50, you start being in a big middle-sized studios where you have a lot of HR management and stuff like this. And especially in countries with social protection, like in Europe, you cannot run down as easily. And we've seen many studios collapsing and dying because one project was cancelled. Yep. Oh, we had a project with Sony, with Nintendo, or whatever. They cancel your project. Generally, people don't put compensations for cancellation. So yeah, you have studios who have to get rid of 50 people in 1 month and pay all the checks to all the employees. But yeah, that's killing a studio. So scaling is a big topic, and I think the industry should go more toward. So it has its extremes as well. So let's take it with a grain of salt. But I think the movie industry and the music industry are more mature in that sense, much more flexible in the way they operate. So I think it's a model we should be inspired of and correct because it has its default as well.
Yeah. No, definitely. No, good. All great points. And you have one more?
And my last point was, please don't forget publishing as a cost and plan for it. So we see a lot of studios who are only focusing on production cost because they want to deliver. But right from the get-go, when they ask for money from a publisher or from an investor or from private money, they should have a number in their mind in terms of publishing cost. I would say it should be at least 30% of the production cost. That's and for smaller games, below 50K or below 100K, it has no sense. It's not really a publishing budget. So at least 100K and at least 30% of the production budget should be a reasonable number to start working with.
Excellent. Julien, thank you so much. And before we allow people or you share, how people can get in touch with you or find out more about Not a Shark, I understand that you have a special promotion for listeners of the podcast that are maybe interested in talking with Not a Shark or working with them.
But with pleasure, yes. So anyone reaching out to us with the code Friends of Not a Shark will get a 20% discount on our services. So yeah, just need to reach out to us with this password, Friends of Not a Shark. Easy.
Yeah, all one word. That's the code. And for those people who either want to redeem that code or just reach out to you guys in general or you, what are some links?
Cool.
Oh yeah, what's your website?
Oh, sorry, notashark.com.
Okay, excellent. And otherwise, you're Julien Ramette on LinkedIn. People can find you there and talk there. And yeah, folks, check out Not a Shark. Lots of great services, things. And as Julien said earlier, it's a la carte. So based off of everything we talked about today, there's lots of options, lots of things. They have something that can help you out. So, Julien, I can't thank you enough. It's been great having you here on the show today.
Thank you very much, Andrew.
Hey everyone, thank you for listening to another episode of Indie Game Movement. I'm Andrew Pappas, your host, and the show's producer is Mustafa Price. Show notes for this episode can be found by visiting rengenmarketing.com, the number episode of the show. Rengen Marketing is a consulting marketing company that helps indie devs with their marketing efforts. Whether you need guidance with your game's marketing strategy or could use a free marketing plan template, then please visit www.rengenmarketing.com and take action. A special thanks to Dakota Saw for Season 2's opening theme and Melissa Gellis for the new logo design. And as always, thanks for being such great listeners, and we'll see you next time on Indie Game Movement.